Today we're going to, is our first day talking about Scrum, which was one of probably the first Agile methodology that got developed and is still fairly widely used. As I think I mentioned back certainly in the first session, it turns out that it is really best suited to product development efforts or large focused projects where the entire team is working and stays working on a single project. And you'll see that as we go along. All right, so you can see that the topics, we'll talk a little bit about the overall characteristics of Scrum. We'll kind of divert a little bit to product and project planning elements because they kind of underlie Scrum, especially since it is focused at more projects and products. And then we'll hit the rest of these topics. But as last week, we have our opportunity for a morning quiz. So if you remember, we talked about a hierarchy in the breakdown of levels of detail, if you will, of requirements. So who can tell me what the top level is? Excellent. And what about this level here? Oh, gosh, you guys are so good at hand. Story. There you go. That was a gimme.
We formed the study group. We're afraid of you now.
Here's the Agile site board again. And so, there I did it again. At least I didn't hit one of those bottom buttons that they still have not duct taped, despite my advice that would be a good idea. So we get requirements, we get the high-level design, which breaks things down to a couple levels, and once again, this level is the
Epics and stories.
The story, yeah, epics and stories. And this is the backlog. Thank you. And this is
The work queue.
thank you. He's probably got something up on his screen, ready to see. I guess I'll say that since Raju doesn't have his screen up or another piece of paper, he was not clever enough to think that maybe. Oh, you do? All right. Very good. Now, what of those elements are required elements of a user story? What has to be covered?
Why? What? Who, why, and what? I mean, not cheating.
Who,
why, and what are the three?
Who, what, and why. That's correct. And if you want to, you can do immediately. But that's
Only bit.
all right. So, who being the user, what being what the requirement is, and why being why is that needed. Okay? The three essential elements of a user story. We talked about estimation last week, and so how are story points used? What are they used to do? What do they represent?
A kind of requirement?
I'm sorry?
A kind of requirement.
No, what we talked about in estimating, we do estimating in a rapid fashion, right? And so story points are comparative, right, numbers that we use to say, oh, this is kind of like that. We gave that 3 story points, so we'll give this 3 story points. So it's part of that kind of estimation poker. So story points are how big you think this particular story or epic, which are sometimes sized using story points, is relative to other similar stories that you've worked on. And who participates, once again, in the estimation process?
Everyone.
Yeah, the implementation team primarily, and sometimes the product owner. Okay. But the critical one is the execution team. And if you're working on any given story, how long should you spend on the estimation of a given story? I'm not looking for an exact number.
It wasn't long.
Exactly. You should spend no more than a couple of minutes on any one. If you can't get to a consensus, move on, come back, and it might resolve more quickly. And there's a number of key practices we talked about of an agile team. And one of the key best practices is to define what? Define done. When are you done with your execution, with your iteration on any given requirement, so that there's no ambiguity as to whether or not you're done. Okay, Scrum. Again, Scrum is probably the first and most common method used in Agile. Characteristics of Scrum: it adheres to the Agile Manifesto. So, there's 4 primary elements to the Agile Manifesto. Remember, there's this is more important than that. Remember? So, can anybody remember any?
Adaptability. How fast we can adapt.
Adaptability is one of it, right? So it's let's see what I can. Customer collaboration, which is part of the adaptability, right? Over contract negotiation, right? So again, contract negotiation is important, but the focus is on customer collaboration. Individuals and interactions within the team and with the customer over processes and tools, right? Close your laptop.
No.
Working software over comprehensive documentation. Right? Deliver working software frequently. And responding to change over following a plan. Change is a good thing. Accept change throughout the process. And as I've said a number of times, it still is true that a change that happens late in the process can be pretty disruptive, but you have many more opportunities through an agile development to recognize that change is needed and introduce the change early. Okay? In Agile, the iterations are called sprints. You may have heard that term. And they are tightly time-boxed, fixed. Usually 2 to 4 weeks, can be 6 weeks. It's decided by the team. 2 weeks seems to be the most common. Okay. And the Scrum method is described as an empirical method that's reliant on transparency. Transparency meaning free communications between the team, like no secrets, everything out there and spoken about. Inspection, so code inspections, examining what's being developed in an open, respectful environment. And adaptation, meaning, one of the goals of Agile is to fail early, right? So you can make corrections and then move forward successfully. So, empirical, what's the implication of empirical?
Everyone knows what's going on at all times with the transparency.
Empirical generally means something you've learned through experience, right? It's through testing. So it's not scientifically predefined, you learn as you go. So the empirical part of this is every time you go through a sprint, you go back and you look at what happened, see what you could have done better, and adjust so that the idea being is incremental improvement throughout the process. And Scrum is usually focused on a single project or product at a time, as opposed to multiples.
In fact, it could still be multiple stories.
Oh yeah, multiple stories associated with the same problem. Right. Exactly. So if we're working in the Scrum method, you'd normally be working on a product, a large project, and to be set up to do that, there needs to be a vision. Someone needs to set the vision for what is this project going to accomplish. If you're out in the marketplace, what do I want this product to be and to accomplish? A broad vision for this product. There needs to be a roadmap that says, this is how I'm incrementally going to get there. It could be, in the case of a product, I'm going to get to this, but I'm going to get there through this series of product releases that have roughly this kind of content in it, delivered over multiple quarters, one a quarter, twice a year, whatever. There's going to be a roadmap that says, here's how we expect to get from here to there. It's not locked in stone because it doesn't work that way in real life, but it's the roadmap for how you're going to get to the vision. And then a release plan that says this is what should be in each release going down. And again, even here you have to be somewhat adaptive. But without that kind of a vision, what are you doing, right? So, a guy named Scott Ambler is one of the lead thinkers, if you will, in product development, but also in Agile. Defined what it means to have the vision. And says, identify what are the business goals. And that applies to what we're doing internally, it applies to a product. What's the vision? And what are the initial requirements, right? There has to be a value proposition, right? If you're developing a product and you're going to sell it in the marketplace, you have a vision for what it's going to do, but along with that vision, part of that vision has to be, when I'm selling this to a customer, this is the value to you, Mr. Customer, and this is why it's worth $3 million or whatever it is of your money to take this product and implement it, right? We have to do the same thing inside, right? If it's a big project, we're taking on implementing North Carolina, and here's the vision of what it will do for us as a university. Here's the value it's going to bring to us. The roadmap a planned future laid out in broad strokes, right? What are going to be the releases, high-level functionality of what we think will be in the releases, rough time frames, usually looking forward at least 2 or 3 releases into the future. So we basically have a structure that looks like this, right? We start out with this product vision, and then we develop a roadmap, and then we develop a release plan. And the vision is set up up front, and it's probably revisited if it's a big product project on at least an annual basis. And that's, this is done at the strategic level, by the product manager, by the senior execs, whatever. The roadmap is something that needs to be adapted based on progress, probably on the order of twice a year. The release plan, what's going to be in each release, is going to be looked at probably quarterly based on what's happened and how the market may change. Okay. All of this is strategic, and it's before Agile. What comes after that could be waterfall, development, could be Agile development, could be iterative development, could be any of those ones we talked about, in the first session. But from the release plan, now we're into Agile, and there's an iteration plan that is put together at the beginning, prior to the beginning of each sprint, by the teams as to what's going to be in that sprint. And then there's a daily plan. Remember I talked about the daily stand-up, about 15 minutes or so. Where are we today? What problems do we have today that need to be solved? And if you're blocked, what are you going to do instead? And what's the project manager, if he's the right one, going to do to try to get you unblocked? That's the daily plan. Okay. So we go from the strategic to the tactical, and we're down here pretty much in the tactical mode. Any questions? This will be on the test now.
I'd like to go to a question.
Yes.
And you may want to get to this later or something, but so for team members, like when we estimate our teams, right, we say they're working X percentage of, support time and other tasks, and we say they're free to do development, some percentage of the time, whatever that number is, depending on who it is. Mm-hmm. When you're a team member here, are they fully 100% on just this, like you would say they're 100% working this and no other responsibilities or things that are thrown in there? One of the precepts of Scrum is the team members are completely dedicated to Scrum, and the work they do is only on the work in the sprint.
Could that be on a sprint by sprint basis? So does Joe have to make that commitment for, let's pick up for side? So you got a 4-week sprint you're planning. He's got to be committed 100% for that 4 weeks.
Yes. You
don't have to look out and worry about the next sprint, the next sprint, the next sprint. He could be committed for the next one.
Could be, but one of the great efficiencies you gain over time largely end up being based on continuity in the team.
Okay.
So
because that's not the model we work in today, by and large.
correct.
So that's another shift that we have to entertain as part of this.
If we were going to try to do this. This is another one of the reasons why I don't think this is a terrific fit.
So that's more of a Scrum characteristic versus a Kanban.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, because I was thinking, you have these
That's a really good question.
daily plans, and someone comes in and says, well, I'm sending Zoho yesterday. Why? Well, that's my other 30% of my job.
I got a 7-1 came in. Yeah.
Yeah, something
With
came
the,
in.
But eventually this would be attractive to a lot of our staff to be able to focus.
yes.
You know,
Yeah, and you get a lot of efficiency, right, when people are focused on one thing. And if we had a big enough project, like we were dedicating people all to stuff, and turns out there's going to be, for example, a lot of development around 9.2, you could conceivably say, okay, we're going to dedicate this small group of folks to doing this, and you could apply the Scrum method in that kind of scenario. But in our normal day-to-day operations, for exactly the reasons Joe mentioned, it probably doesn't fit very well. Key team values. Each team member individually commit to achieving their team goals for each and every sprint. That literally means at the end of the sprint planning, person by person by person, they have to say, yes, I commit to getting this plan done. And that may mean I'm doing just what initially assigned to me, or it may mean I'm doing more. But I'm going to work with this team and we're going to get this done. Every team member has to commit to that, or you're not ready to start the sprint. So along with that comes the need for courage. It says when things occur, we got to be ready and able to work through those problems and stay on track. And this gets to your point, Jeff. Focus. There should be no work done other than through the backlog for the sprint. In this case, the sprint backlog specifically for the sprint. The work here. Openness. Yeah, we've talked about this a number of times, right? Open communications. People who tend to be shy and wallflowers have to work their way out of that mode and get their thoughts out on the table because they're always valuable. So openness, be transparent at where you are. If you are having a problem, don't pretend you don't have it. Get it out there early. There's only 2 weeks to get it done. Right? And respect. Respect the competency of everybody on the team and treat each other with the appropriate level of respect. So how does Bob's made-up Agile framework work with Scrum? So some things, look very much the same, right? We talked about the release plan, right? Well, this is sort of where the release plan comes out. There's the requirements, there's the design, there's the ethics and the stories, and then it says basically ultimately what's going to be in the releases, and it may be roughly laid out. And the ethics and the stories go into this work backlog, right? So there's a stack of stuff that has to get done for the release they're working on, let's say. Okay? But in any one sprint, during a sprint planning session, they said these are the stories, or sometimes an epic in there that still has to have some work done on it, that we're going to get done in the sprint. Okay? Then you get into execution mode. So people get assigned their stories, they start working on them, daily basis. There's the daily stand-up, key element, right? Where are we? What am I committing to do today? What did I complete yesterday? What problems am I seeing that we need to get addressed? All of that, right? And then Once during the sprint, you take a few hours out and you do what's called backlog reading. We'll talk more about that. But that's going back through here, right? And sort of in preparation for the next sprint, right? What's different, people may have been feeding new stories into that backlog as things occurred to them that are needed in the release or in the product overall. And so those things need to get evaluated. They need to have stories done if they look like they're need to be done in the near term. Right? So that's that. When the work is all done, you've got all of these stories through the implementation, through the change management work, you're done, right? That's when we talked about this. There's a demo to the product owner and perhaps other executives. We're showing you what we completed in this sprint. It has to be executable, it has to show value. It may have warts, and you can be upfront and say, yep, we still got some bugs here and some bugs here that need to be worked out, but this is what we've delivered this sprint, so that they can, one, get comfortable that, yes, it's still moving in the right direction, this is what I'm looking for, and they can give that feedback to the team, and they can increasingly gain confidence that we're going where we need to go. So from their standpoint, remember we talked about the risk profile, they're seeing the risk not diving down because they don't know what's going on, but they see it, gradually decreasing. After you've done the demo, the team does the review, which basically says, okay, what happened, what went well, what didn't go well, a little causal analysis, okay? And then there's sort of a separate session to take some of the learnings out of here. It's called the retrospective, where you go, okay, so given what happened, given what we learned in the review, what should we change, if anything? What's the changes for the next sprint? Okay?
So, Bob, question on the demo. On a smaller scale, it looks like the demo will be equivalent to our UAT sections that we do with the customers.
On a smaller scale, it would be only, it's not so much that the product owner is actually doing the demo. They're being shown the demo.
Okay.
So but the concept is similar. They're getting confidence that it's doing what they needed to do. Any other questions? Okay, let's talk about the backlog.
Before you go, so development, it takes a while to develop something. So is it necessary that you still need to meet every day?
Yes.
We can say development will take 2 or 3 days, so we meet after that.
Every day.
You're still checking on it.
Checking on it every day. Right. Stuff comes up. I'm developing. I'm supposed to be done in 3 days. Guess what? Something's happened and I've got a problem. And this isn't like a long meeting, right? This isn't sitting in a room for an hour. This is 15 minutes standing around your small team talking about what's going on, and then you're off to work. But it's a meeting that's held every day. You pick a time, 9 o'clock, maybe 7:30. And you run through it. It gets to be fairly efficient, right? And there's going to be, later on you'll see there's going to be some vehicles that get used that help you visualize a little bit better as to where you are, and helps facilitate the meeting. So the backlog, again, it has user stories and some epics that are candidates for being implemented. it's dynamic. Remember, we say change is good. So a story may be modified, a new story may come in, stories may go away. Right? Guess what? We changed our mind. We don't need this. Right? So it is dynamic and it will change. It is managed, and that's through a couple of methods, but the one we talked about today now is grooming, the regular review of that backlog with the team and the product owner, right, and perhaps some executives participating in the grooming process.
What happens when you do the requirements of the development change or you change your environment on that? What happens if your partner is with the project and then for product development and then some big mission comes in and you have to totally start all over again?
Just like any project,
Yes,
right?
happens all the time.
The management team has to look at where they are, has to look at what their priorities are at the top level and decide whether they're going to make the adjustment in schedule and cost to proceed or whether they're going to stop. Same logic, right? It still applies. The backlog should be, they say, deep meaning detailed appropriately. Things that have a higher priority, and I'll kind of modify the term priority in a minute, should have more detail. And in this case, we'll say higher priority means it's probably going to be worked on sooner than later. Okay. Estimated. Initially, it could be fairly coarse-grained for planning purposes, but before it gets into an actual sprint cycle, it's going to have to be down to the story point level that we're comfortable it fits in whatever the sprint length is. Emergent, once again, changes as necessary, and then prioritized, and I put in parents ordered, because there may be a story that's very high priority to the release of the product overall, but it's not really time for it yet. So when we say priority here, we really mean logically ordered for purposes of getting the release out. So who does that prioritization? It's normally done by, remember we talked about the Agile senior team? So it's the product owners, the executives, the project manager. And it again needs to be a fairly efficient, non-time consuming process. And so there's two common methods used called Moscow. Buttons are not in the right place. Maybe I should hold it this way. Called Moscow and China. And the prioritization of the backlog needs to happen as often as is needed to ensure that there's clear current guidance for the implementation team as they're going into the next sprints. It's best to set a regular cadence. Some people get to implementation points where they get more mature or something and they do it ad hoc. But certainly, as you're going initially, you should set a regular cadence with this team getting together and prioritizing the backlog. So, Moscow, right? What are the ones that I must have? So, baseline requirement. Should have, could have, won't have, at least not in this release. Right? The as a rule of thumb, 70% of things that get sent into a sprint should be must-haves. And then the other 30% split between should-haves or could-haves. Focus on the most important stuff. Kano, similar. Must-have, satisfiers. Things that beyond the base requirements are going to be viewed as having value and something extra of use to the customer. And then there's the writers. And they say basically, try to put 1 or 2 in per release, not per sprint, per release. Okay. And then dissatisfiers. It's basically candidates to get out of the queue. And again, same rule of thumb. 70% should be must-have, 30% a mix of these two. So again, this should be a fairly quick process, especially since they go through it on some sort of a regular cadence. Questions on that? Well, you guys are going to get out of here early today. Good. We talked about user stories, and we focused in our first discussion on the title of the story, right? The story statement. As a user, I want what so that I get why, right? That's the user story. After it's been gone through the prioritization process, it's going to get a priority. Usually gets written in the lower left-hand corner. They typically are done on index cards of some size, right? And then the story points that are assigned usually get written on the upper right-hand corner. So as you're going through, you can determine how big it is. But you need to add something else. Before you put it into the sprint, like anything else, what are the acceptance criteria? This is a requirement. What's the minimum requirement for it to be accepted? And then just a space for comments. It could evolve through the sprint, right? You learn something and then you write it down. So it's a documentation method. So, first, Scrum is best suited for products for large projects. You really have to have these elements, the strategic vision and the roadmap, crucial prerequisites before getting into the implementation phase. The key team values we talked about, right? Commitment to completing the elements that are in the sprint, the courage to do whatever is necessary to complete the sprint. Focus, we're working on stuff that's in the sprint, not other stuff. Openness, that's the transparency, communicating, right? Respect for your teammates. We have to have a prioritized/ordered backlog as key enabler for choosing elements for the sprint. And by the time it gets into the sprint, the stories have to include the title, the story, again, user goal benefit, the priority of the story, the size and story points, acceptance criteria, comments, and then, as we'll see later, other stuff that will get added along the way.
Seems like, for me, I think that the team aspect of it, and almost like not everyone on my team could work on a project like that. You know, I mean, honestly, you say commitment, courage, and not mean like courage, but like, are they willing to be criticized? Are they willing to be called out? Not, in a respectful manner, but still say, what it seems like this is that, Chris and I are, having, and he can say, this is your, whatever it is, that whatever conflict, this isn't really what you're looking for, and then, however that comes across, I think, even like certain people you have to consider is who can work in a team environment like that and who can't. Who wouldn't thrive in it as well as others would.
Well, I think we need to manage our people though so that they grow into it. Yeah. Right? So it's not designed to be it's supposed to be constructive criticism or a good way to work. It's not you stink, your code's bad, or Christian, your requirements are garbage. You're the reason we're behind. I might have misunderstood, but sit down for a minute, figure this out. Right? So I think our people need to be mature enough to work in this role. So I think this is the way we want to work. I mean, I'm not saying it's Scrum, but we want to do something.
Still the basic thing. Yeah.
Really close collaboration.
And certainly it's one of those things that as you go along, cycle by cycle by cycle, people get more comfortable with the operating method, get more engaged, more enthusiastic if we're doing it right, and we get better results. You'll also see when we talk about next week, you start keeping some metrics. What is the typical volume of work that we seem to be able to get through the sprint?
Right.
In terms of storylines. Right? You track that. And then when you plan your next one, you plan it based on that past experience. And over time, if things are going well and the team is in place and constant, right? The number of story points you execute in a sprint will go up. And you'll get more efficient. And pretty soon you could do Connect Carolina in a week. Yeah, okay. Maybe 2 weeks.
So, Bob, on the note of feedback from our testing or any work you do in the sprint or the Scrum, I'm guessing that will be part of the last point, or maybe the standard, where we get constant feedback on the actual work, as opposed to giving general comments.
Well, remember that the testing is part of the sprint.
Okay.
So you're the BA working on this sprint. You have written a lot, if not all, of the stories. When we went through the story point estimation, you described your story. People had questions to get clarification. There was some discussion around the table before the estimation was done. So hopefully people are pretty clear on what that story is by the time they start. And as people start delivering that code, you're going to be testing it during the sprint as the stories get complete. Hopefully all the stories don't all come out at the end where we've kind of got a problem, right? You want them to be small enough that they're coming out incrementally and you have time to test it. The change management team has time to see it, well, it's actually coming out. They already have an idea because the story's been defined. So all that is happening in cycle. So it's not like at the end of the sprint, we hand it over to test and wait for their feedback. No, it's all part of the same process.
It can be broken up because when we've done it in the past, it doesn't work well to try to do communications and testing in the same sprint, or maybe depending on how long the sprint is, because then development, if it slips, you still have to try to make it so that it ends up being that the change management works. I'll have to for the last 3 days, or it's easier just to schedule it if you can, schedule it in separate sprints. because you end up with deliverable code is not tested or documented, but in the next sprint, your deliverable
Yeah,
code.
I can see where that would happen. You get to the end, and the final thing comes out, and it hasn't been tested. 2 weeks are up. So,
Yeah.
and that actually is part of the evaluation at the end of the 2 weeks. It is possible that at the end of the 2 weeks you had planned, I'll make this up, 20 story points, right? You got to the end and 16 were complete, done, as step 9 defined, right? Done. 4 are still hanging out. They may be all around completing testing, and then that's one that has to factor into the planning for the next sprint. So part of the next sprint is completing that work plus the new work. Thank you. Any other questions? I knew I'd have at least one that would only go an hour. And less than an hour, actually. So that's it for today. Next week we will finish up on Scrum, and then we'll spend a couple weeks on Kanban, and then wrap with kind of a review of all that we've covered, and we'll have some discussion about how we think we should best apply this in our organization. And once we make some of those decisions, there'll have to be some more training of the execution teams, the initial teams, so that they get ready to try this on for size. The slides get posted up on SharePoint. You all know where that site is. And when Rebecca and company finish getting the webinar done, it's posted up there with a link to it anyway. So you can go back and look at prior ones, you know, make funny jokes about me or whatever makes you happy. If nothing else, thank you very much. Have a good day.